My encounter takes place in Kansas City. I was 19 years old when I happened to encounter something spooky. Sometimes I still can't believe that I even saw anything at all. I live in a small neighborhood with my family. In this small town, where nothing of importance or anything exciting really ever happens, I witnessed something possibly supernatural. I grew up reading about cryptids and monsters and listening to alleged encounters with such entities, but until now, I'd never actually seen anything. I still love hearing stories about Wendigo and dogmen wishing to encounter one. I've always wanted to be the one who saw something. Even if their encounters were dangerous, I wouldn't hesitate to look for one. But I guess I just never got the chance. One evening after work, I was drawing in my bedroom on a freezing night. I usually spend my evenings after work texting my friends and drawing fantasy creatures on my phone to pass the time. At one point, later in the evening, I was reminded by my mom that I needed to take the trash down to the end of the driveway for the garbage truck to pick up the following day. It was a freezing autumn night, and I didn't want to go outside and freeze my ass off, so I waited until I was about to go to bed to take the trash down. We have 5 trash cans that we lead out for the garbage truck, since it's a very big family. I put my jacket on and head downstairs. It's around 11:30 p.m. at this point, and no one else is awake except for me and my dog, Scout. Scout has 2 dog beds, one in the dining room and one by the front door. When I walk downstairs, Scout has her muzzle pressed against the window and is focused on something outside. At the time, I thought it was a raccoon. There was one that lived in the tree on our front lawn. But now that I'm thinking about this encounter, I don't believe that Scout was watching a raccoon. I think nothing about what she might be watching outside, and I head right on out. I walk over in front of the garage doors, grabbing each trash can individually and taking them down to the end of the driveway. I'm putting trash can number 3 down at the end when I hear what I can only describe as a scrabbling noise. It sounds like something is climbing down a tree. Depending on the animal, you can often tell how big it is by the sound when it rises or walks. It didn't sound like a small animal. It sounded rather big, like bare skin on the bark. I turn and see a figure peeking out behind a tree. It's about as tall as me, but the cover of night makes it hard to distinguish this person's facial features or skin color. From the outline that I could see of this person, they were deadly skinny and seemed to be malnourished. I used to be so gullible and tended to make new friends, even with people who didn't like me. It was this gullible friendliness, however, that tipped me off that something was off about this individual. I assumed it was just a homeless person or maybe one of my neighbors. "Hey, sir? Ma'am? What are you doing out at this hour?" I asked politely. The individual in question did not move from their spots, but I could see their breath forming little clouds in the air from the coal. Their left arm was wrapped around the side of the tree trunk facing me. I could barely make out the outline of its bony arm in the near pitch black of the night. I turned away momentarily and pushed trash can number 3 next to the other 2, and when I turned around, the figure was gone. I was baffled. I had only turned around for a split second, and it had disappeared without a sound. I went over and inspected the tree where it had just been standing. The ground had been disturbed where it had stood, and there was a faint mark on the tree from where the person had wrapped its arm. I looked up at the tree and even pointed my phone light up at it. I finished taking the trash cans down quickly because it was freezing out there, and whatever unidentified person was standing in my front yard only a few seconds ago was gone. To this day, I think I saw one of 3 different cryptids. I think it was either a rake, a skinwalker, wendigo, or maybe like a hide-behind. For those who do not know, a hide-behind is an old cryptid that was allegedly seen by loggers in America's early history. Supposedly, a monster hid behind trees and used the trees as cover to hunt for its prey, humans. Supposedly, people did die to attacks from hide-behinds back in the day, but nothing has ever been verified. Descriptions of the hide-behind vary from being a large reptilian to a big, black, furry beast. To this day, I haven't seen it since, and I kind of want to see it again, even if my initial experience was very creepy.
My name is Clara. I live in the upper state of Michigan, and I love to hike and camp along with some hunting. I went out one day with my stepdad to go hunting so we could catch us some deer and whatnot. Once we got to the location where we went to go hunt at, we got out and packed up our gear we had brought from our house. I smelled something foul like a pile of garbage or rotting fish mixed with some really bad body odor. We ignored it as we thought something might be dead laying around nearby. We made our way through the woods onto a beaten-down path we had found close by. Once we got quite a ways, we stopped and took a couple of minutes. After we took our small break, we heard a huge crack in the background behind some large bushes. My stepdad instinctively grabbed his sidearm from his holster. And that is when whatever it was growled at us and sped off. Whatever it was sounded huge and very fast. We, of course, ignored it, but hiked even faster to where we needed to go. Once we got there, we set up camp and started to make lunch. We had a hot dog with a side of salad. As we ate, I started to smell that putrid smell again, which almost made me vomit my food back out. I had to pee, so I went off being near dusk. I grabbed my flashlight and a hunting knife to take as protection just in case. I squatted down as I was about to take a pee, until I saw something move off in the distance. Freaked out, I shined my flashlight at whatever it was. I could see orange or red glowing eyes shining as I stared at something, and I started to become even more frightened than I was before. I pulled my pants back up and ran back to the camp. I told my dad about what happened, and he went to check it out. Only after a couple of minutes, I heard a loud scream the direction my dad had run off into. He ran back panicked, real bad with blood oozing down his knee. I asked him what happened, but he stayed silent. He packed up our stuff as fast as he could and walked fast back to the truck. Once we got halfway there, we heard a very loud call from something I've never heard before. At that moment, we started running as fast as we could, nearly tripping over roots until after a couple of minutes or so, we finally made it back to the truck. We packed everything in the back and sped off. We went straight home, and we tried to go straight to sleep. But before that, I saw his knee, which looked like it was hit by a big rock or something. He still hasn't told me what happened, but I do have a very, very bad feeling that he got into a tussle with something out in those woods.
I am an Australian who has spent most of his life surrounded by the bush. This makes me accustomed to all of the weird noises that may come when night falls. This incident occurred one night at around 2:30 a.m. I was watching YouTube with my cat, who was asleep. All of a sudden, I heard a loud shriek, like you would imagine a howler monkey, cross-human shriek would sound like. My cat's head shot straight up, looking out of my window. His back arched up and he started hissing and acting all aggressive. I have decorative rocks outside my window, so when anything walks in it, you can hear the rocks moving. I heard them moving outside, like a person would walk through them. I slowly got up out of my bed and made a crack in my blind so I could get a better look outside. My blood ran ice cold as I saw it. It was about 6 to 7 feet tall. It was completely naked. It was also completely hairless, and its eyes were locked onto mine. Its body turned to face me as well, so I was staring directly at it. We stood like that for what seemed like hours, just keeping each other in our sights. I glanced down at the creature's hands. It had a dead cat clasped into its grip, blood dripping from the body. I locked eyes again with it and noticed the creature had a mouth. I don't know why, but that freaked me out the most. It started to turn away, to walk down my road. I rushed to put my jeans and a shirt on. I reached into my cupboard and pulled out a torch and a knife I always have hidden in my room. I opened up my back door and ran down the road. I saw the thing casually stroll into the bush behind my house. It took me about a minute to summon the courage to enter after it. I walked into the bush with the torch and knife in hand. I heard scuttling behind me. I turned around and my torch illuminated a possum. Freaked out, I told it to bugger off. It stared at me blankly. I turned around and walked for another 500 meters or so. That's when I found the cat's body, mangled all to hell. That made me rethink my previous decision. As I turned to leave, all of a sudden I heard that same shriek. I ran as fast as I could, dropping my torch in the progress. I finally made it to the back door. I opened it and ran straight into my room. My cat was looking at me. I patted it and passed out of my bed. I woke up the next morning at 10 and strolled out to my kitchen. While I was making my morning coffee, I looked out my window. My jaw dropped, because all along the outside of my wall, there was a deep gash. I called my father, and he came to have a look. He said it looked like when someone drags a screw against someone's car, but this looks too deep to be a screw mark. I thanked him for freaking me out even more. We covered the gash in plaster and went on with our way. I have done some research on what it could possibly be. I kept coming back to the rake, but that is just a creepy story, or at least I thought anyway. I personally think that it was a humanoid creature, but I have no idea what. Thank you for reading this, and if you could help me find out what this is, I would appreciate it.
I just moved to North Dakota to work the oil field business with my friend I'll call Sean. I was initially unsure of what the job entails, but I knew it meant a lot of income and being able to see and work, and my longtime friend sold me on the deal. As it turned out, I loved the job. 12-hour days and on day shift, but the kind of money we were making was the easiest street in my opinion. I mean, basically, all we did during the day was stay on site and make sure the place didn't burn down. The job was perfect. This all came to a halt one day when my boss came to me and asked if I wanted to work night shift instead, and even go around to different sites. We all know, if your boss is asking, it's likely not smart to say no. So, I accepted. Basically, I checked 6 sites, 3 times a night, with 2 hours of downtime between each site check. Now, to give you an idea of the placement of these sites, just imagine sites at least 12 miles apart, sometimes further, in the middle of nowhere, with only old farms and some dirt roads near them for miles. That's how these sites were, and how alone I'd be while out that night. One other thing is winter was just setting in, so we had constant snow and blizzards. Now that you've got a great visual of my situation, I will begin to explain an experience I had while working the night shift. There's one site, out of all the sites, that is particularly creepy. This site is the farthest one away on my route, and is in the most dimly lit of all of them. Arriving at the said site, I pull up to the pump house, put on my gloves, my hard hat, switching my line knot as I do, and step outside. Walking around, I'm careful with my steps as the headlight only illuminates what you're looking at. Everything else is a pitch black, cold, snowy abyss. The thing about the snow is you can tell if anyone has been around or is around, but there were no truck tracks, so I knew I was alone. My usual search goes from left to right, looking closely for leaks or potential leak areas on the tanks, which are roughly 20 feet by 10 feet wide. As I'm coming up on my last tank, I notice what looked like a pair of white tennis shoes dart behind a tank. My first thought is, what would anyone be doing out here without a truck? This made my stomach sink, partially out of confusion, but mostly because I was 20 miles away from civilization, alone, and it was like 15 degrees outside. The thought again crosses my mind. What would any sane person be doing out here without his truck? Slowly, and quite hesitantly, I go toward the tank I saw the shoe from. I'm taking it slow, one step at a time, and I'm beginning to feel on edge at this point. Just when my heart feels like it's about to explode a tiny bit, a white rabbit comes out hopping from the area. I throw my head back, breathe a sigh of relief, and have a laugh of the realization that it was just a bunny. This being the end of the line, I find a place to park soon after and kick back in my seat to relax. You need to understand, sleeping on the job isn't something you're supposed to do, But it happens sometimes, and before I knew it, I passed out. 40 minutes later, my body spazzes awake and I look around to see no one. Needing to pee, I step out. But before I can even step on the ground, I freeze. There are tracks in the snow, leading up to my truck. These aren't rabbit tracks either. They're human-like. They aren't the right size to be mine either. The tracks lead over to the tanks I was checking earlier. I question, who the hell could be out here and why? I began to get that sinking feeling again as I followed the tracks. I made sure to grab the biggest wrench I had from the truck just in case. Whoever was out here, were they crazy? Did they potentially need my help? I wasn't sure, and about 20 feet from the dark tank, I freeze and call out, asking who's there and if they need any help. Silence sets in for a minute, the only sound coming from the snow and the wind blowing it. I feel simultaneous loneliness, and yet I know I'm potentially being watched. The loneliness is the realization I'm on my own, and if something goes wrong, I'm probably screwed. Trying to set this thought aside, I try to tell whoever is back there I'm aware they're there. Still, silence is the only response I get. I walk forward 5 more feet and peer around the tank area. What I see doesn't register immediately, but when it does, I'm in shock. There's blood, and I mean lots of blood. I felt nauseous, but was curious, so I stepped closer. That's when I see an antler. Is it a deer? Finally, I make my way close enough to see a dead deer. Its throat slit and blood everywhere. The thing was, its organs were in clear display as well, and streaming on the snow, so I know the kill was fresh. Someone or something had eviscerated this deer and left it here. Who or what would do this, and why? I turn my attention back to the shoe prints, and while it's obvious there was a lot of shuffling around the deer itself, I'm not convinced, just yet, that whoever was there was responsible for killing the deer. This was then I noticed the shoe prints leading off and back to the tanks. Slowly, extremely hesitantly now, I follow these tracks. I'm shaking, but not from the snow. No, I'm shaking from fear. The tracks themselves appear to be blood red. The tracks lead to a drop-off, and I peer off into the distance, when 40 feet away, I see something that makes me damn near shit myself. The thing I see is half of a human face peering back at me from over the hill. The face was old, tattered, with long, mangy hair and blood from the nose down. I jumped so hard I fell, but was immediately on my feet seconds later. I threw my stuff into my truck bed, got into my truck, and floored it as far and fast as I could. I was dizzy and couldn't help but think that that thing had been right outside my unlocked truck door, looking at me while I slept at one point. If it didn't already have the deer, would it have done what it did to the deer to me? I never told my company about the person or thing that I saw. I simply told them I noticed the deer and thought it was strange. At which point, they removed the body. An older resident of the area, who was on site that day, mentioned it looked like a couple coyotes got to it and were trying to drag it out of the predator's sight. I knew better though. I still work with the company. Until this day, I still work nights and have to check in on this site. I'm always in and out in minutes and never linger, nor do I sleep out there.
One rainy night in the middle of May, 2003, my friends and I were hanging out at around 9 p.m. We are Navajo, getting water for the livestock in Sunrise, Arizona. We are having a good time, and Tony was driving. I was on the passenger seat, and John and Cody were sitting in the back seat. We were all telling jokes and cracking up until we reached the windmill. Once we'd arrived, we started the water and waited for it to fill the barrel. While waiting, we decided to go walking around looking at the local cows. Unfortunately, this led to the barrel overflowing, at which point John ran to pull the hose. John is a professional sheep herder, by the way. After the situation was contained, we went back, and at this time, I was going to drive. At least, I believed I was, as when I got into the truck it wouldn't start. I tried several times to start the truck, and even looked under the hood to get it to do anything. Nothing was out of place, so I went back into the truck and tried again. Tony, John, and Cody wanted to go mess with the cows, and so they soon left while I continued to work on the truck. While working on the truck, there was a sudden sound that was so loud that it made me jump. I recollected myself after that, thinking maybe it was just the guys throwing rocks to scare the cows. The moment I started working on the truck, I heard the sound once again. I got out of the truck and yelled for the guys to stop making that sound. Soon after, they started to come back. Once they got back to the truck, I asked them if they were throwing rocks at the windmill. They all said no, at which point, I got chills. When we made our way back to the cows, Tony stuck with me. While chilling with Tony, we all heard the sound again. This time, it was a harder hit. Tony yelled to them and told them to stop doing that. The others didn't answer. Usually, they would reply to him pretty quick. He called them once more, but no one yelled back. We got worried, and we started walking out into the dark looking for them. We called out their names, but no one answered. The only light we had was the moonlight, which kept coming in and out of the clouds as we didn't have any flashlights on us at the time. This made it extremely difficult to see. After about 10 minutes, we finally found them. They were on the ground, almost shivering, and their eyes were wide open. Tony and I thought about the worst that could have happened. We have heard stories about these skinwalkers. We have experienced encounters before, but not like this, or at least not with us out here in the open. We knew what we had to do, but we didn't know if there was only one or a few. Then, we heard something scrambling in the bushes nearby. Tony and I freaked out, as soon after we heard it again, but on our right this time. Soon after that, we heard it on our left, and then in front of us, and then behind us. This all happened in about 3 seconds. We got the chills, to say the least. I knew Tony almost always had some Navajo mountain tobacco or blessing cedar to protect us from the skinwalkers, but he didn't have either of it this time. Tony and I made a run to the truck with the half-naked bodies of Cody and John. We heard the footsteps of something running after us as we made it back to the truck, and we all got back in. The second we slammed the door shut, it got unnaturally silent. Soon after this, the witchcraft that the skinwalkers put on Cody and John seemingly wore off. We were just about to relax when some sickly-looking coyotes jumped onto the hood of the truck. There were 3 creatures that had the body of a coyote, but had a little more human-like features. They could walk on their 4 legs, or just their back 2 legs. They had eyes that were crystal and blood red. They had the smell of dead animals. The smell was so unbearable we all fell back into our seat and started to scream in disgust. The creatures started to sing or chant, and we knew they were speaking in Navajo, but we were so terrified we couldn't even tell what they were saying. This was when some tall, long-haired, furry black creature with crystal-like eyes showed up just outside Tony's window, breathing heavily, with the ugliest face we've ever seen. Tony looked at it, and jumped back so quickly and powerfully that he almost knocked down Cody. The creature blew something like powder through the window onto us. We all started to slow our breathing and calm down, and after a matter of seconds it was quiet, and we all passed out. When we woke up the next day, we were face down, ass up, in Tony's bedroom. We never found out what happened to those skinwalkers, or us for that matter. We had a series of ceremonies that were used to protect us from the sickness that the skinwalkers placed upon us. The medicine man told us that the people who did this were after us because of jealousy. They were jealous of us because of all the things we have and all the accomplishments we've done. So, we had their power turned around to backfire on them. After we had the ceremonies, Tony went back to his house, and his mom said that night, we just walked through the door about 1:30 a.m., got a glass of water, and went into my room. She also said we were quiet. She thought we were sleeping. To this day, we still hang out with each other. We still get water and take care of the livestock. We will never forget what happened that night. That's for sure. This happened when I was 12 or 13 years old. I live in southern Michigan, and a lot of strange things happen in these woods. So, little backstory here. My dad and I volunteered for a bird banding station. Bird banding is where a researcher catches a bird and puts a tiny numbered band on its leg to study its migration patterns. We were careful to not hurt the birds, so we set up mist nets to catch them, rather than a traditional trap. They were always released in the end. The land we banded on was owned by the head researcher, let's call him R. R's property was massive, with forest, marshlands, countryside, you name it. I loved to explore it while the banders were tagging birds. However, something happened that made me be more cautious when out in the woods alone. It was a slow summer morning, and I was walking through the forest enjoying the day. All of a sudden, I hear this wailing sound. It sounded like a distressed deer or even a cat. Being the big animal lover I was, I went looking for the wounded animal. It wasn't long before I came to the edge of the property. Something was wrong, however. The noise sounded much farther away than it did before. The woods around me were also completely silent. I happened to look to my left to see a hunter's blind. Once again, I got closer. I noticed something bizarre. It was badly torn on the sides, as if someone got a knife and sliced into it. Suddenly, I hear the same distant wailing sound again. So I did something stupid. I made the noise right back at the thing, hoping that whatever it was would show itself. Not even 5 minutes later, I hear this low growling noise just about 20 yards to my left. Even after wandering the woods for most of my life, I've never heard a sound like that before. I had to get out of there. I made a run for R's house, and it wasn't long before I came to his yard, and I stopped to catch my breath. All of a sudden, I hear the same low growl coming from the bushes less than 10 yards away. So I ran all the way up to the research shed to find R. It wasn't long before I told him what I had heard. I told him that possibly a deer had growled at me. He was a very scientific guy after all, and I doubted he believed me. But, in the back of my mind, I knew this was no deer. I believed that whatever this was trying to lure me off the property and do who knows what. A few days later, I learned about skinwalkers and how they mimicked animal sounds and even voices to lure people to their deaths. Although I luckily never saw this thing, I believe it was a skinwalker looking for its next victim.
Hi, Swamp Dweller. It's been about a month since I last sent in a story about some unusual experiences I've been having. Recently, I've been having crazier things happen on my property. I live in one of the most secluded areas in Georgia. It's nice and private, settling on a few thousand acres with about a 250-acre lake and no neighbors except the local wildlife. It's been family-owned since 1810. As houses have been built and rebuilt, I have had to do further research to discover why these experiences are happening to me and my family. It always appears safe during the daytime, but becomes incredibly different when night comes. During my research, I discovered this property was once a hideout for a local Cherokee tribe. Occasionally, I hear knocking on wood, knocking on the house, possible rocks being thrown below the windows, and so on. My last experience was just last night when the sun was almost out of sight. Coyotes just started becoming more active. I hear them howling and the birds are always whistling. It came to a point when all the animals suddenly went quiet, and the only thing I heard was footsteps crunching on leaves. There are no bears in this area of Georgia, but whatever it was huge, and our giant animal is usually a deer. This is central Georgia, not too far south of Lake Sinclair. We don't really have alligators either. I could scratch off every possible animal because those footsteps were massive. You would know it was much louder than any known animal if you heard them, like an elephant walking through. The footsteps finally stopped about 30 yards into the thick woods. The next thing I hear is what sounded like some kind of gibberish ritual, but it wasn't quite in words. I had never heard anything like this before. Even my wife heard it, and we were both on the upper back porch. We liked to sit down and enjoy the sun setting to the west side of the lake, but it was already completely dark when we heard this thing speaking in what I could only assume was tongues. I tried using a battery-powered spotlight to see where this thing was, but with no success, as it kept saying something over and over. The next thing I know, something was thrown towards us, landing on the porch. It was about 2 to 3 pounds. It was a rock, and it was pretty big. I picked it up carefully and placed it on a small sandwich bag. It might have had some sort of fingerprint evidence, I don't know. I turned it over to professionals to get a good look at it, but I don't think anything really ever came of it. I know it might sound weird to do that, but I need to find out what's going on here and what this creature is. Earlier this morning, I began searching for professionals and only found something called cryptozoologist. Since no other known studies are based on this experience, I never told my daughters or my family about this because they wouldn't understand. My daughters are only 5 years old, and I don't want them to be traumatized by this. When cryptozoology appeared on my computer, it talked about the legendary Bigfoot, their biggest passion, and a few others known as cryptids. I'm hoping to go into the woods with my wife tomorrow to see if I can find any fingerprints, and I would love to share some pics with you if we can get anything on camera.
Now, before I begin this story, let me first start by clarifying that alligators are not native to Michigan, which is what made me so skeptical about believing this legend until I had an in-person encounter with him, the Michigan Gator Man. A little backstory on my family. We recently purchased a house in a small town in Michigan's Upper Thumb. Caseville, Michigan, was a quiet beach town famously known for its cheeseburger festival. It seemed like a family-friendly town and a perfect place to spend summers. Everything was excellent the first year or so living there, and then we began to hear whispers around town about the legend of what I was supposed to believe was the Gator Man. We figured it was some form of hazing that people did to new people in town and brushed it off. On the 4th of July, the town had fireworks, and about 12 of us decided to sit on the sand to view them. Our street had access to a private beach, so we were the only ones there that night. Everyone else was on the public side of the beach in the distance. My cousins and I were having a great time actually, dancing to the music and just goofing off in general. Then, we hear something coming towards us in the distance. It's a low growling sound. We stare, but we don't see much because it's very dark along the water. Either way, there's a big group of us, so we weren't too terribly threatened by it. At this point, the cricket stopped chirping, and any voices in the distance became muted. Even the waves of Lake Huron seemed to hush. It became dead silent. My cousin Kurt points toward a low growling sound, and he says that there were 2 yellow glowing eyes growing in size as something was coming towards us. The loud crash of fireworks pulled our attention away from whatever it was, and when we looked back, it was seemingly gone. We began watching the fireworks show and soon forgot all about it. Our attention is pulled away from the fireworks as sand flies over our heads from behind us. All of us whip our heads around to see it. A figure of a man stands in the dark. Only once the flash of fireworks illuminates him enough to see what he truly is. His skin seemed to glow in the light. He looked skinny, almost scaly. We couldn't get a great look at him because of our light source. It was flashing in and out, of course. The grand finale of the fireworks began and we glanced away for just a split second. And suddenly, a splash of the water happened. This weird man was gone. After the fireworks show ended, we all decided this was pretty creepy and didn't stay at the beach for much longer. I tried to rationalize how he looked in the light, and maybe just thought he had a nasty sunburn or some sort of, skin burns or something like that. The following day, we headed back to the beach to look for any evidence that could bring some sense to the situation, and just to be safe, we got our dog with us. What we found made our skin crawl. Leading from the sand to the water was what I could only describe as gator tracks. But here's the kicker. A piece of driftwood was floating in the water next to where the tracks led, and it looked to have some sort of odd scratches and bite marks on it. I moved to get a closer look, and my dog instantly began growling and refused to walk any closer. This made me uncomfortable enough to listen and to head back to the house as fast as possible and get as far away from these tracks as I could. That night, my cousin and I decided to go back to the beach for an evening swim, but mostly to look for the Gator Man. I now understand that this wasn't the brightest idea, but we were bored and wanted to figure this thing out. We reached the sand, using our phone flashlights to look for any sort of evidence, but we didn't find anything interesting, so we swam in the water. We were in the water until our cousin felt something rush up against her leg. As our initial shock was settling in, our eyes began adjusting to the dark water. We saw some air bubbles and immediately felt the tension in the air. A tall figure slowly emerges from the water in the moon's light. Those same yellow glowing eyes met mine for a not-so-appreciated second time. He was angry, and we needed to leave this water. We knew immediately this was his beach, and he had the upper hand, especially in the water. We booked it back to the house, never looking back to see if it was following us. I still can't visit that beach to this day. I still see those glowing yellow eyes when I close my own. I don't know what the Michigan Gator Man wants, but I feel sorry for those who find out.
Good evening, and thank you for sharing my story. This encounter still troubles me to this day. It was the summer of 2011. I recently had turned 12, and my family thought it would be a great summer for a cabin trip. Normally, I would have been attending some sort of Boy Scout camp. Since we are from Florida, we drove north to South Carolina with my grandparents coming down from Canada to meet us. The cabin itself was beautiful, with a great view of the lake and its own beachhead. When we first arrived, I was first out of the car and running around in excitement. I was greeted by a man looking to be in his late 50s, the cabin owner. He smiled at me with happiness, which slowly grew into a nervous grin. Finding it quite odd and being a shy kid, I moved along. As I searched around the area, being curious and wanting to see everything, I noticed almost a circular pit under the house. It was off-putting, but it didn't seem to bother me. Finally, I noticed a treehouse that the owner was building on the beach. As I ran to it, he yelled out, "Watch yourself, son. It's still dangerous." I steamed onwards and climbed up the ladder. The man was correct. As the top, there were so many nails poking out all around. But since I was small, I found a place to stand and gaze back at the cabin. The wood cabin seems old but sturdy, with a big porch and outside storage underneath, where once again, I stared at this circular pit, which now had my full attention. It was nothing that I've ever seen before, and I don't think I've seen something like it since. I love the woods, and would like to say I am experienced, but it almost looked like a big spinning ball was dipped into the earth. I pointed it out to my father and the owner, who was talking. The owner responded with, "There used to be a bear that nested there, but don't worry, he's long gone." I didn't like his answer, because it seemed strange for how it looked. I brushed it off and went into the cabin, picking up one of the bunk beds before my siblings could. The first few nights were amazing. Lots of hiking and swimming and everyday things that you would do, because we knew when our grandparents arrived, we would be hanging out most of the time. When they did arrive, we sat by the fire at night and enjoyed animal watching. It's important to note the area's geography at this point. The front of the cabin faced a wide strip of dirt leading to the beach with thick trees on either side. To the left of the cabin was the dirt road we used to get to it. Behind and on the left of the cabin were thick, dense woods with a steep slope. Now, it was the 7th night that we were there. I was awoken up by weird sounds outside. Dirt shifting under a weight to the left side of the cabin. The trash bins were there next to the door from the kitchen. I heard something pushing them around. Thinking it was most likely raccoons or some sort of interested animal, I should do my Boy Scout duty and shoo them off. I dropped down from my bunk and the noises went silent. I noticed a few rays of sunlight were streaking through the air. I walked over to the kitchen to look out the window, but before I could reach it, suddenly, these long, scratching noises were coming out from against the walls of the cabin. It sounded like long nails, digging deep into the sheets of a bed. Terrified at this point, I slowly back away. Then a bang shook the door and I jumped. Since it was only me, my brother, and my dog who were downstairs, we were the only ones who heard it. Instantly, my dog sprinted to the door barking and growling viciously like he was about to fight to the death. This woke up my brother, who panicked and grabbed me and pulled out his hunting knife. He looked down at me with reassurance and told me to get to my parents' room. He then pushed me upwards towards the stairs and ran to the door and opened it. He then went away with my dog, the barks and running getting distance as I ran upstairs, and I woke up my father. He ran out into the forest with his Colt 45. About 30 minutes later, they both came back, including my dog who was limping. I've never seen my brother with the look he had on his face before that day, and he never had that look ever again. He's typically a very brave and capable older brother, and seeing him like that unnerved me to my bone. He was an Eagle Scout, and I was a Boy Scout. We had been in the woods, and we weren't really scared to get dirty. My dog had a stick through his front left leg, but he's a good strong boy and took it like a champ. My mother and grandmother quickly drove our animal over to the local vet. While they were gone, my father, grandfather, and oldest second brother and I looked around the cabin for evidence of this strange event. I was still incredibly nervous, so I kept close to the cabin and my father. The trash bins had gashed holes in them, almost like they had been punched open, and the wall above had deep claw marks in it, which, standing from the level of the trash bins, was about 6 feet into the air. That's when I noticed a smell. An odd smell that wasn't coming from the trash cans. I slowly crouched down between peering underneath the cabin and where this strange pit was. There was a dead fox, shredded into literal pieces. I told my father, and him and my brother quickly cleaned it up by using a shovel and tossing it into a bag and then into the trash. My dad contacted the owner, who assured us that there was nothing to be worried about, but brought us a flare gun and bear mace. A couple of days go by, and my parents take everyone to a restaurant aside from myself, my oldest brother who chased the perpetrator, and my injured but stable dog. An hour after they left, I looked out the second floor window in the direction where my brother ran a few nights prior. I was petting my dog at the same time. That's when the main encounter took place. My dog raised his head alert and sniffed the air. I glanced out the window and noticed this huge bear-like creature high up in one of the trees. It was matching my level and was staring at me. I say bear-like because it had human-like features, instead of the fat, round body bears usually have. Their body was toned, sharp, and muscular. The eyes were the worst parts. They were piercing. They were yellow, almost like perfect human eyes that locked eye contact with me. Fear flooded my brain and forced me into a fight or flight mindset. My dog, picking up on this, started growling and howling at the window. I turned to run into the room and looked back at the creature, who was now rapidly descending the tree, using its clawed hand to climb. I sprinted to my brother's room in tears, yelling about this beast that I just saw. My brother looked at me with worried eyes and said, "This territory doesn't belong to us." Then he got out of his bed, grabbed his knife and baseball bat, and walked downstairs. I armed myself with a flare gun and bear mace, and prepared myself for the possibility of this thing breaking in and attacking us. A great slam into the back of the wall knocked the cabin around. It made it rock like a boat and sent my dog into a frenzy. Between the growls and barks, I could hear heavy breathing from outside and things being thrown at the cabin. A rock broke one of the front windows and striking my left leg. I turned and fired the flare gun out of the window, which was followed by many profanities and yelling. After this, it all stopped. My dog was still growling and pointing at the corner of the room. There was no window facing that direction, so I couldn't see, but I could assume it was right there. A few minutes of silence went by when my brother and I decided to call the police and our parents. Then, being idiots, we walked out of the front door and slowly walked around to the right side of the cabin. We started to hear a slow snarl coming from behind a bush, and my dog inside started going ballistic and jumping at the door. My brother started yelling at this creature and threw his baseball bat towards the bush, striking it. It sounded like it hit a tree, but we both know that we hit the creature because it let out a pained grunt. The black furry mass sprung out from behind the bush and bolted down the dirt road, and we quickly lost sight of it. We hurried back inside the cabin, barricaded the doors, and ran upstairs. We heard gunshots ring out moments later, and my father's truck pulls in. I fly downstairs and open the door. The rest of my family ran inside, and my father claimed a huge bear ran down the road, and he fired a couple of rounds at it. The police eventually came after having a hard time finding the cabin. We gave them the story about this aggressive bear attacking the cabin. We left that night, and my family likes to recall the story of how myself and my oldest brother fended off a hungry bear. But for me and my brother, that was not the case. When we arrived back in Florida, I went straight to my room, still shaken up by what happened. When my brother came in, he looked me dead in the eyes and said, "It looked human, didn't it?" I just nodded and asked him about his territory remark when he looked down and responded, "Every animal has its territory, and usually can keep it until something bigger comes along and takes it." Well, something bigger came and it took its own territory. What he said still makes me wonder to this day. It's burned into my mind. Looking back on it, the owner was so shaky around me, almost like he knew there was more danger in the area than he was letting on, and that he knew that we would be a target.
Hello, Swamp Dweller, and anyone who may be listening to this. I'm a long-time listener, but this is the first story I have ever submitted. It has bothered and spooked me for almost a year now, and I would love any input that anyone has on it. Last year, around June, I was camping in the middle of nowhere, Arkansas, with my boyfriend James and his friend Lane. We were generally having a good time, hanging by the creek, building a fire, and listening to groovy tunes. We continued to hang out into the night and were all partaking in some drinking. This makes the next part of the story seem unbelievable, but trust me, it was just as incredible to us at the time, and we were there. We were all sitting around the fire when James and Lane spotted a small fire off in the distance. This was strange since we hadn't noticed anyone camping nearby all day. We ignored it for a bit and continued having a good time until we all went to sleep around midnight. I remember waking up sometime a little bit later feeling immediately confused and frozen with fear. It was still dark. I turned to James, who was already sitting up and listening intently. I heard sticks cracking just outside the tree line, just outside of the tent. I realized that there was either a person or some sort of creature walking around outside. Couldn't tell you if it was a bear, a wendigo, or some sort of freaking spaghetti monster. All I know is that we sat up, frozen in silence, and unsure if we should be afraid or not. Suddenly, I heard someone attempt to open my car door. It was locked. I heard two distinct pulls on the handle, and then an urgent whispering. James and I froze. Well, we thought it had to be people at this point, and Lane was alone in his tent about 15 feet away. We sat waiting for whoever this was to leave, with bated breath. I was terrified because of what happened next. I swear, these voices, they sounded human, but the way they were going back and forth almost made them sound ethereal. This was something weird. The whispers initially started with things like, this was a bust and these guys didn't have anything suitable to steal or something along those lines. Then, we heard a third voice come out of nowhere saying, maybe we check the tents. Frozen in fear again, we waited as long as we could, in full anxiety mode. My mind was relieved that I heard their heavy footsteps approaching the fire that we had seen earlier. Now you might be wondering why I'm sending this in under the cryptid category. Well, that's because in the morning, when we looked out to see if there was any sort of footprints or anything like that, there were none. No footprints, no feet prints, no shoe prints, nothing. Also, when I said that the voices sounded ethereal, it almost sounded like they were whispering right in our ears, but somehow we could hear them all the way across to where our car was. And on top of that, we did hear a lot of rumors about, gnomes, fairies, trolls, all sorts of weird things that are said to roam these sorts of areas. So maybe it was something like that. Or maybe it was just a band of thieves who were incredibly light-footed. I couldn't tell you. What I can say is, though, we were all super freaked out, since those people, creatures, or whatever, could have severely hurt us if they wanted to. But we were relieved that they thought of our stuff as worthless or whatever. We decided we would not be camping anytime soon in that area, though.
Here in England, we don't do Halloween like you do in the United States. At least we don't in Bolton, a sub-district of Manchester. A few children dressed in bin bag capes with witches' hats on or a skeleton mask will knock on your door, holding up little pumpkin buckets out for sweets, and some neighbors will put out some sort of paper gravestones in their windows. They go a little bit with it, but that's about it. Last October 31st, 2022, however, the weirdest thing happened at our home. Our family were all sitting at the front of the TV watching the Exorcist movie when a hammer was at the back door. We all stopped and looked at it, and then looked at each other. To knock at the back door, you would have had to got through a wrought iron side gate, which is always firmly locked. The knocking continued, getting louder and more urgent. My grandson, who is 15, got up and went to the kitchen window to investigate. I heard a stifled gasp and went to join him to see what was happening. Despite being a teenager, he is 6 feet tall and does boxing training, so he's no real little weakling. I joined him at the window and asked what was the matter. Face pale and confused, he said a massive bird-like creature had crawled along the lawn and crept into the corner of the garden near the back fencing. He was visibly shaken. The car park to a country park nature trail is at the back of our fence, so I immediately thought some local kids were having a Halloween joke and jumped the wall. Despite it being 8 feet high, I thought maybe they were just pranking us. I told my grandson to tell the rest of the family what we had seen, and I told him I would check it out. He panicked, and I heard him shout to the rest of them still watching TV. He was shaken up at the crawling creature he had thought he had seen, truly. I grabbed a torch and went out into the garden. We have a lot of mature trees, shrubs, and bushes, and at the corner of the garden, I heard a rustling. I pointed the torch toward the noise and walked towards it. There, with its back against the fence, was a bird-like creature about the size of a small child. It was perched on a grassy mound with eagle-like talons for feet, a smooth body, outstretched wings, and a pointy face that resembled a giant rat. I was confused and walked towards it while it looked at me, with its head downwards but eyes looking up at me. It spread its wings and they fluttered like a bird when it was ready to take off. Then there was a prolonged hissing sound. I stopped and looked behind me for backup. I saw a few family members coming out into the garden. The thing gave one last hiss, rose into the air, looking more like a gargoyle than a bird at this point, and disappeared over the fence. It made some of the shrubs waver as it went. My grandson and I described what we had seen, but the rest of them laughed and said it was just our imagination. They admitted to seeing the shrubs swaying, but they put it down to a giant kestrel or something. They didn't believe a word of it. To this day, I do not go into the back garden after dark. That was not a local kid enjoying a Halloween prank, nor was it a visiting kestrel. It looked like a church gargoyle. It's never been back, and I don't want it to return. So this year, if there's a knocking at our back door, my husband or son can investigate this time. I prefer lavender and lilac in my garden over cryptic creatures. This happened to me when I was a teenager. I think it was in the spring of 1998 when I was 14 years old. My Boy Scout troop went hiking in the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. I grew up in a very small town in Tennessee, and the boys in my troop were people I'd known my entire life. We were all very close and knew each other very, very well, and trusted each other. We had been hiking for 5 days or so at this point, and it was pretty miserable. It rained every single day, and we were all exhausted and sore, and hungry. We were covered with blisters and anything else you could imagine. The adults realized we had bitten off a bit more than we could chew in trying to do a 60-mile trail, especially with the awful weather. So we changed course and had gotten off trail to spend the night in a drive-in campground, the kind of place with hookup for RVs and picnic tables and fire pits and such. There's also a central bathhouse with showers and toilets. It was in a very remote area, far from a town or any other house. There may have been a few other small groups there, but if there were, we never interacted with them or saw any of them. We were all filthy and wet and thus very excited about taking a hot shower. It was dark and we had finished dinner. A group of 5 of my friends, including myself and my friend Jeremy, who, like everyone else in our group we had known since we were babies, headed up to the bathhouse, which was maybe a quarter-mile walk through the pitch-dark woods, up a worn-down gravel walking trail. I stayed behind to clean up, and about 10 or 15 minutes later, I followed them by myself. I had a weak little flashlight, the old incandescent kind, pre-LED. I remember the woods were totally silent. When I got about halfway to the bathhouse, I could see the light from it off in the distance through the woods. I heard a noise from my left. I looked over and saw my friend Jeremy standing by an old-school manual water pump about 20 feet off the trail. The kind of pump where you raise and lower a handle to pump up water from a well. There was a strange light behind him, like the moon had come out from behind the clouds. I was startled to see him there by himself in the woods off the trail. I asked him if he was already done with his shower. He seemed kind of, sad. He said, "Yeah, it's all yours." I said okay and didn't think much of it until I got to the bathhouse. When I walked in the door, my friends were all in there, and I heard Jeremy talking in from the shower. All the blood drained out of my head, and all the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had to sit down before I passed out. My friends were freaked out and wanted to know what was wrong. I told them exactly what happened. They nervously made jokes about how I must have been smoking pot. This was long before any of us had experience with any kind of mind-altering substances, but I could tell that they believed me. Like I said, we had known each other forever, and we knew that we wouldn't exaggerate or play a joke on each other like this, at least not to this extent. I was physically shaking. It was almost impossible for this to be a joke. We all waited together until everyone was finished showering and brushing teeth and whatnot. Then we all walked back together in total silence. When we got to the spot, whoever I had seen was gone without a trace. The water pump was there, though. No one had noticed it before because it was way off the trail and obviously not in use. We got back to our campsite and went to bed, thoroughly freaked out. I remember not sleeping much that night, and all my years since then, I've never been able to figure out what happened. Was there a random teenage boy in the woods who looked just like my friend? This is unlikely. Did I hallucinate? Unlikely, but possible. Who's to say?
Hey, swamp dweller. My name is Pam. I live on the northeast corner of Mississippi, less than 10 miles from the Tennessee and Alabama state lines, and 70 miles from the infamous Taylor, Mississippi. A granddaughter, who is 11 years old, had an encounter with the cryptid a few months ago. Let me describe what happened and what she witnessed. Sometime around 11 p.m. we returned home from the county fair here in Alcorn County, Mississippi. My home is approximately 6 miles from town in a relatively rural area containing lakes, trees, and fields used for anything from tomatoes to soybeans and even cotton. My land is almost 20 acres. We have our home, a barn, a shed, and a lake about 200 yards from my house. The rest is trees and a few cleared out pieces. Anyway, back to Saturday night. A granddaughter, A, decided to walk outside to find her kitty before she went to bed. The husband and I were already in bed, and why she went out without waking one of us shocked me, but she didn't wake any of us up. She didn't even wake us up when she returned after seeing this thing. She did get in bed with us and slept with us that night and the next night. However, the following day, while fixing breakfast, she walked into the kitchen and said, "Mama Pam, y'all have some kind of strange dog out there." I asked her what she was talking about, and here is her answer. "When I went outside to find Kitty, I started walking to the front yard and saw something huge in lights. I thought it was a dog. When I got closer, it looked more like an old, bad, skinny grandpa. She was walking on his hands and legs, and then it got up on its back 2 legs. It looked around and it saw me, then it ran toward the barn. Pam, I ain't never seen anything run that fast." I asked her if she had seen the face of this thing, but she told me that she did not. She didn't get to see it long enough to see any real features. She said it only looked toward her for just a few seconds, and it was too dark to make out any discernible facial features besides that it was bald. I know my eyes were as big as saucers. I knew what she had seen wasn't anything from around here. She told me it was very skinny and again bald, and it looked like it had trouble even walking on all fours, making it hard for her to believe that it could run so fast. She said on all fours it was jerky, but it wasn't like that when it was on just 2 legs. I told them I thought it was a crawler. I could not believe she didn't come screaming for me and my husband to wake up. She said at the time, and in her 11-year-old mind, she didn't consider it harmful because it was frail and seemed to have such a hard time walking. But she did say that when it took off toward the barn, it was a lightning fast. She said that's when she got nervous. She returned to bed with my husband and me when she saw how fast it actually was. I know she's telling me the truth because she's never been exposed to anything that would even remotely give her an idea for this story. Not to mention, she doesn't really lie, to be honest, and she slept with me and my husband for the next few nights as well. She's really not a kid to make up things. She's down to earth, a cheerleader, a soccer player, a softball player, and an all-around, well-rounded kid. I hope somebody listening to this in the swamp can answer these following questions. Have any of you ever heard these creatures anywhere else around Mississippi, Tennessee, or the Alabama areas? She has a 4-wheeler, a bicycle, and does a lot of outdoor activities. I'm scared to let her go do those now. Are we in danger? Thanks for sharing my story. Too afraid to go outside by myself now as well. Many people believe what they perceive in the world is reality. Everything they see, touch, smell, and hear is real, and will always be real. This always goes for things that they don't believe in. We live in a world where they no longer fear the monsters in the dark, believing we have discovered all the apex predators of the world, such as the sharks, the orcas, the bears, the wolves, and large cats, and we believe we are on the top of the food chain. While it is true, we currently have no natural predators, we are merely prey of opportunity. This doesn't change the fact that we are prey nonetheless. One doesn't get to experience the feeling of being hunted, of being stalked like a wolf stalks an elk. The feeling of dread you feel as the eyes of a predator are staring into you, waiting for you to make one wrong move. I was 14 at the time. I had short black hair and braces that made me look like the biggest dork you have ever met in your life. Funny enough, I was. While I played lacrosse and was semi-athletic, what I lacked in coordination and speed I made up for with a deceiving amount of brute strength, an amount that didn't make sense for my small stature. I was in Phoenix, Arizona for my annual summer trip to visit my grandparents on my father's side of the family. My grandparents seemed like opposites. My grandfather is a tall, semi-muscular man, standing at 6 feet 6 inches in height and weighing easily over 190 pounds, who never seemed to take anything seriously and loved to crack joke and tease others. My grandmother was tall for a woman, standing at easily 5 feet 9 inches, was rather skinny. She didn't make jokes often but always seemed to laugh at my grandfather's jokes. The only similarities I ever felt like they really shared was their love for their family and their love for going on walks and hiking. They also owned a beautiful dog named Lucy. Lucy was a rescue when my grandparents got her, and such she came with their own issues. She was a fond of bigger men and hated big dogs, yet somehow that didn't seem to stop her from loving any of the men in my family, including my grandfather. If he saw Lucy from a distance, you'd think it was just a large fox. Her fur was the orange color foxes have, and her tail looked just like a fox. In truth, no one knew what breed she was. Even after having become a registered veterinarian assistant, I still have no good guess. The only thing I know for sure is that she at least shares some part of German Shepherd, as she shares the same common characteristics they have, including the medium size, pointed ears, snout, and her love and undying devotion to her owners. The morning after I arrived at my grandmother's, they told me that they were going to hike up Camelback Mountain, a mountain that got its name for looking like a camel's hump. I hated the idea of doing this. Like most high schoolers, I just wanted to lay in bed and watch YouTube, especially since this would be the first year I didn't have my brother Jalen to keep me company. Jalen was my older brother, who had 6 years on me. He had just turned 20 and decided he needed to work to save up money for when he goes back to campus, leaving me to go on a trip by himself. I wasn't upset. Obviously, this is a decision he needed to make. but I was sad about it. Up until 8th grade, he had been my only real friend that I could really rely on and open up to. As I was sitting in the car with my grandmother, I remember staring out the window, admiring the scorching sun, and listening to the steady panting of Lucy in the back. I looked up into the rearview mirror in hopes of seeing her smiling face and instilling confidence in me. I yawned and rolled onto my side, facing the passenger side of the car, and closed my eyes. While I slept, I remember reflecting on the story my grandfather on my mother's side of the family told me a few months ago. These grandparents only lived a few hours south of my family, so I visited them more often. My grandfather, who I will refer to as Papaw to help separate the two, is a short, overweight man who loved his grandchildren more than life itself, but he took a liking to me more than anyone else. I think the reason for this was because I took the time to listen to his story. Papaw had served in Vietnam when he was younger and had numerous stories to tell, a few of which were almost unsettling. He told me of creatures, the likes of which we humans have never seen before, living in the jungles there. He told me how the creature was more dangerous than the Viet Cong soldier or animal or anything like that. He also gave me survival tips in case I ever found myself stuck in the woods and felt unsafe. If you ever feel like you're being stalked by something, do not run. Pray runs. His voice echoed in my head. Don't ever scream, pray screams. If you see the creature stalking you, do not meet its gaze. Most animals take that as you challenging it, and while humans are extremely capable creatures, being able to rely on adrenaline to take down a lot of animals, there are creatures in this world that will butcher us without hesitating. His words seemed to burn themselves into my head. All you need to do is make yourself look as big as possible and walk out of his territory as fast as possible, while still walking. The last of his words echoed as I felt someone shaking my body a little bit. We're here, Josh. It's time to wake up, I heard my grandmother say while rocking my body back and forth. We both got out of the car, and I gave Lucy the treats I had promised her. As I stood outside the car holding Lucy's leash, I breathed in the fresh air. It smelled quite different from Indiana, as it didn't carry the swamp smell Indiana's humidity usually carries with it. The air was much thinner, making me more confident that I wouldn't be able to run nearly as far as I would be able to at home. As we walked along the trail, my grandmother and I side by side with Lucy leading the way ahead of us, I made idle talk with her as we walked down the trail. The mountains were beautiful. While one would imagine it just to be a barren desert there are specific parts of arid trees and cacti that turn into a sort of forest that, combined with the beautiful blue skies and warm, almost boiling hot weather, made it a beautiful day to hike. As we continued to walk, I felt this sense of dread growing inside of me. The further we went, I looked down to Lucy, whose ears were now up and alert. Her body was low to the ground. She sensed something near us. I began to feel uneasy. The mountains of Arizona had many creatures inhabiting it, which include black bear, mountain lions, elk, deer, javelina, coyote, antelope, along with a lot more. I looked at my grandmother, who didn't seem bothered at all. This feeling of dread grew bigger and bigger, the weight of it sitting on my chest. Something was staring at me. I could feel it piercing my soul. I recalled my papa's advice and attempted to make myself look as big as possible, which admittedly wasn't very big at all. My goal was to make myself seem like I just wasn't worth the trouble. I looked around, trying to spot anything out of place when I saw it. Peering around from behind a cactus was some sort of creature, covered in black fur. I couldn't see its body because it was behind the giant cactus, but I could tell it was easily as tall as this cactus was. This thing was easily 7 feet tall. I tried to avoid its gaze, not wanting to accidentally challenge it, but it felt as though my eyes snapped to them on their own. Its eyes were black. Not black, but more like they were completely void of light, except for a small amount of yellow. Their eyes were beady and honestly soulless. The longer I looked, I noticed this giant hand reaching around the front of the cactus. Its hands was big enough to fit my head inside of it, and it had 2-inch claws at its fingertips. My head snapped away from it, and I looked ahead. Grandma would need to turn around and leave. I said, trying not to show fear, but wanting to get the urgency across. Oh, but we haven't made it halfway yet, my grandmother said with the sound of sadness in her voice. I needed to come up with something to get us out of there. I looked down to Lucy, who was still walking forward, but her head wasn't looking ahead. She was looking at my right, the direction I saw the monster watching us from. "Grandma, I don't feel good. My stomach hurts and I feel nauseous. Can we please just go back? I promised we could take Lucy on a walk a little bit later," I said, trying to sound as sick as possible. "I guess that is fine," my grandmother said almost disappointingly, as she really wanted to take me to the peak this year. When we turned around, I made sure to keep myself between where I had seen the monster and my grandmother. As we walked back down, feeling the dread continued to get worse. This feeling of hopelessness, that you are no longer the scariest out there anymore. That at any moment's notice, something could decide to take you out of this world. When we got back to the car, I noticed we were still the only ones out there, which is strange, as it was usually a place to go hiking that was very popular. Lucy reluctantly got back into the SUV, preferring to stay outside and keep watch while my grandmother got in the car. While I finally got Lucy in, and I got myself in, I looked ahead on the trail. There was something, somewhat obscured by the foliage. It was a hulking animal of some sort. It had the face of a dog with its long black snout, but was easily bigger than any black bear I'd ever seen before. It stared at me, into my soul once again, but it never moved, only stared at me, which was almost scarier than it charging us. We went back home, where I sat in my room and immediately called my papa. Honestly, he would be the only one that would believe me. 2 days later, my grandmother told me she had seen something weird on the news of a few hikers going missing on that very same trail. She thanked me for convincing us to leave. I still have never, ever gone back to those mountains. Even as I've gotten bigger and more experienced hunting and such, I just don't trust it. I now carry a serrated pocket knife that my papa had given me for my 15th birthday everywhere I go. I will never forget the advice he had given me.
Visions of Death by Sam. This story takes place when I was 16 years old. I had just been dropped off at school and I was going to the cafeteria. I went to sit with my best friend, Jack. When I looked at Jack, I saw this creature that resembled a person but was covered in darkness. It had no face or discernible features. He was standing right behind him with his hand on his shoulder, not forcefully, but just like resting. Its head then turned to me and followed me as I approached him. He asked me why I looked so spooked. I told him nothing because he didn't believe in the paranormal. He was a firm Christian, so anything I would have said, it would have just called me crazy. We went throughout the day, and every time I saw him, it was right there with his hands on his shoulder. When I got home, I asked my mom what it could be, or if my great-grandma might know. My mom told me she calls them reapers. They're not necessarily malicious or anything. They just comfort those who are going to die. I broke into tears after hearing this and ran to my room. I ended up passing out, and while I was asleep, I had a dream of my friend's point of view. He was in our friend Todd's vehicle, and he looked like he was listening to a speaker in the back seat, not buckled in. Todd crashed into a tree, Jack went through the windshield and snapped his neck, and then I woke up screaming. My mom and sister came in to see if I was okay. I said I was fine and I just had a bad dream. Nothing to worry about. The next day was a Friday and the Reaper followed Jack. I told Jack about my dream, thinking maybe I could warn him about what would happen. But I thought he would just call me crazy. The Reaper looked at me and shook its head. I wonder why it did this. Maybe it was telling me that I couldn't or shouldn't interfere. I ignored that it was there for the rest of the day and went about my business until around 5 p.m. My friend called me and asked if I wanted to go to a party. I said, yeah, just come get me, and we'll go. He told me he had a ride, and Todd would be there. I screamed at him, no, don't get in Todd's truck. He told me to chill. He said he was on the way and hung up. So I went on my way to the front porch for him, hoping that my dream wouldn't be real. But after an hour of waiting, my mom got a call and told me what I hoped not to hear. He had died to basically the exact same play-by-play I saw in my dream. I turned around and the Reaper was standing in front of me. It put a hand on my shoulder. I screamed at it to leave me alone, and it just disappeared just as it appeared. I don't know what happened. My dream came true, and it's something I'll always scratch my head about. I don't know what that creature was, if it really was a reaper, quote unquote, or some sort of like afterlife messenger, I don't know. But I don't want to find out. In 2007, I was 18 years old and I grew up hearing all about the Michigan Dog Man, and really didn't believe it. I played in the woods a lot as a young kid. One warm fall day, my boyfriend, myself, and 2 friends went out to see my grandmother at our family cabin. When we got there, my 2 younger cousins were there. They wanted to walk down to the river, so we all went, leaving my grandmother to have some alone time without the 2 young boys. As we walked up the hill, the boys wanted to race the 2 older boys. So, when we got to the start of the trail, going to the river, all 4 boys lined up, and I yelled, "Ready, set, go." As the boys ran down, us girls were yelling, "Run, faster, who's going to win?" Just then, a huge buck came out of nowhere. My boyfriend grabbed one of the young boys out of the way. I saw the buck and looked to see where it had come from. See, my family is very into hunting, and we hadn't been quiet by any means. This deer should have heard us long before we were close and ran off before we saw it. As I looked to where it came from, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like my brain and eyes were fighting to make sense of what was happening. A huge, black dog standing on 2 back legs was standing there. It looked like a man with a dog's head. It wasn't looking at me. It was looking at my boyfriend. It then looked to be out of breath, like it had been running. I looked at my boyfriend and he was looking at it, but the others were watching the deer. When I looked back, I saw it run back down the hill. I ran up to my boyfriend. His eyes were wide and he looked at me. All he could say was, "Yes, I saw it too." The young boy and our 2 friends didn't see it, luckily, so we went to the river and back to the cabin. We left and my boyfriend really didn't want to talk about it. Later that night, some more of our friends came over and all the boys wanted to play Guitar Hero. As they played, I took a picture of them. Now my boyfriend and I live in a very old farmhouse. The windows are floor-to-ceiling windows. They're about 6, maybe 7 feet tall. In one of the pictures, you can see my dog laying on the floor asleep, and all the boys in the picture. Well, it was a week or 2 after the picture was taken, and my friend wanted to see other pictures I took that night. So I put them on my laptop. She was staring at them when she yelled for me and my boyfriend to come. She zooms in at the top corner of the window was a dog's face with its mouth open. We couldn't believe it. After she left, my boyfriend and I sat there looking at it. Had this thing found us or followed us? Was it mad about the deer? Maybe I'll never know, but it was terrifying. This story starts at my mom's place in Ohio. I was 11, and I've always believed in things like Bigfoot. At this point in time, I'm at my mom's house spending time with her, her boyfriend, and my brother. My parents being divorced, it was nice to finally get a week off to be able to go out and visit her. One morning, we all get up and go to Raccoon Park. My family is fishing there, when our dog, Rue, runs off. I go off in search of Rue, and while looking for him, I notice some boats. I grab Rue and return him to our family. My mom and I decide to take one of the boats onto the river. They aren't fancy, they're just those little pedal boats that you can rent. While pedaling, we decide to go to the other side of the bank, near a forest, to see if we can find some fish. As we got closer, we began to hear rustling in the trees. We didn't think much of it initially. We figured it was probably another person or maybe a raccoon or some other animal. Eventually, we narrowed down the possibility to an animal, as people weren't really in the area we were at. This was when something fell from the tree. We thought maybe a squirrel, but that's when we noticed there weren't any squirrels around. Then, out of the blue, a huge log flies by us and lands just super close to our boats. Freaking out, we immediately pedal away, back to the boathouse. As we were heading back, I looked behind me and noticed a 9-foot-tall, hairy creature watching us from the trees on the bank. Shortly after, I noticed the creature. It darted off into the forest, never to be seen again. I initially thought I was hallucinating until some people in the park, on the bank, asked if I saw what was across the way while pedaling back. 2 weeks later, I'm video chatting my mom, and she mentions 2 guys took a pedal boat out by the area we were at, and while they were there, something attacked them from out of nowhere. They weren't hurt, more spooked, but they did get a decent glimpse of this creature. I'll never be sure what it was, but I'll always believe it was Bigfoot. This happened roughly a year ago. I have been hunting for 30 years, and in all that time I've never seen something like I saw on this day. I am quite familiar with the woods, and I have no problem handling myself. On this day, though, I've been hunting all morning, and it was about noon now. I was beginning to get this eerie feeling like I was being watched, but, even more so, stalked. I turned around slowly, and didn't see anything. The forest is normally alive with wildlife, and there is generally all sorts of noise. But, at this point anyway, there was absolutely nothing. No shrubbery moving, no birds chirping. There was deafening silence. I continued my hunt, watching closely, hoping to find a deer I could be proud of, a real trophy buck. What I found instead was far more scarier. Looking a short ways away, I almost didn't notice it at first, as it was so still. I saw something staring right at me. This beast, that I mistook for a deer before examining it more closely, stood at 7 foot, 4 inches tall, and his antlers looked like trees. It had the eyes of a cat, was completely silent, even when moving, and it simply just stared at me. Before I knew, I had heard a sound to my left. I looked over for a second and saw nothing, and looked back toward the figure only to realize it had vanished. Looking at my phone, I realized it was around 5. Looking at my phone, I realized it was around 5, when it was just noon moments ago. I was supposed to be in from hunting at 1 in the afternoon, but somehow, the time had flown by. I'm not sure what the thing I saw in the woods was, but I'm positive it wasn't a deer. I can't explain the missing time either. Any explanation would definitely be appreciated. Years ago, I used to backpack around the States. I was in New Mexico searching for elusive ditches and pools to skateboard. I got a few directions from locals, and it's free for all to find these places. Some are sketchy with crackheads and weirdos, and others are invite only. So I've been searching all day in Gallup. It's a solitary pool next to a trailer park. I speak with the owners, and they said it was cool for me to camp here. Just be inside your tent at night. I didn't ask why out of obliviousness and poor hearing. I thanked them and skate all day till dusk. I had a bottle of Jim Beam, and I was psyched about where I was as a self-reflection. Little did I know I'd be terrified later that night. I'm getting hammered and singing songs and laughing. Suddenly, I hear a loud scream. It was like when you're angry and spaz out when skateboarding. It sounded like my voice, as I slammed earlier, like it was me, but tinny, like speaking in a fan, like that hollow and echoey sound. I had heard of skinwalkers, but assumed it was a Native American boogeyman as I am white. I had no idea it would be real. I stayed in my tent most of the night. However, I did hear scurrying about, mouth-breathing smells of rotten meat and snorting, like it was sniffing the area. I asked the owners the next day what the hell that thing was. They said, "Oh, you heard them?" They did a protective ritual and put up a talisman for warding them off. They told me of others who skate this spot having had very similar experiences. However, I won't be going anywhere near that spot anytime soon. I will conclude with this. I am an adventurous type and a daredevil at heart. That said, I've been through way too much in the city to mess with supernatural entities. I'd take stabbings, robbery, being shot twice, mangled by a friend on flocka and bath salts, and getting jumped any day. I would rather face those sketchy human moments than skinwalkers, as I've won some and lost some. But, in my experience reading these stories online, I don't think skinwalkers lose too often. My friend and I were hanging out one night when we decided to go into the woods. While searching around, we noticed that all the sounds of wildlife has suddenly disappeared. This is usually a sign a predator is in the area. We walked slowly and carefully as we wandered the forest. Suddenly, we see this tall, lanky figure in the distance, with patches of brown fur. It looked too large to be a human. There was something off about it. We waited to see what it'd do next, when we suddenly noticed it was looking in our direction. Freaked out by this, we hid in some nearby bushes, staying as still as possible. The creature slowly moved by, and when it got really close, I thought we were going to die for sure. Thankfully, a few minutes went by, the longest few minutes of our lives, and whatever this creature was, decided to move on. We waited together, slightly till we were sure the coast was clear. After this, we booked it home and locked the door behind us. We were scared but grateful to be safe. My friend tried to get footage of the creature, but when trying to film it, the creature had a strange distortion and froze up. It hasn't worked since, and my camera is more than likely busted. Ever since this incident, I always hear strange whistling noises and odd sounds through my neighborhood and from the woods. Only late at night, though.
I'm 13 and I just moved to a rural area in Holland with my family. Even as a child, I was never your typical girl. I was quite tomboyish and even would play with worms, mud, and at times even dead animals. Now, though, I had 4 acres of wooded area to explore, so my German shepherds and I were very excited. After dinner one night, I told my parents I was taking the boys out back to play. The first thing I did was let Max and Riley do their business near the house, and then off we went to explore. Around the side of the garage was a cornfield. We walked alongside this until we reached a dirt mound. I chose to climb over this, but Max and Riley decided using the cornfield was the best route into the woods. Once an opening in the field appeared, my 2 dogs would join me. Upon arrival in the woods, I made sure to keep Max close as he would defend me. Riley, on the other hand, was a big baby and would run at the first sight of anyone new, so I left him on his own devices. Anyway, the boys and I continued deeper into the woods. Inside, there was a huge hill you could see from my house, and the boys and I began climbing it. When we reached the top, we chilled for a bit while Max played with the rock and Riley darted around paranoidly. I had heard things about goatmen and other cryptids, but being a seeing is believing type of person, I wasn't worried about that sort of thing while out in the woods. After our short break, I decided to climb down the hill and head back to feed my neighbor's chickens. As I'm climbing down, I tell Max to follow us, and as I turn my head to the right, I notice a tall grass is now moving. The realization that both my dogs are to the left of me hits hard, and I quickly scramble out of there. My dogs, knowing something was up, follow close behind me without even having to ask. I'm spooked by all this, and, be sure, as I type this out, decided against a normal policy of leaving my blinds open when I crash at night. Something strange while running. I looked back and I noticed that these things that were coming out of the bushes seemed to be similar to what these things that are called melonheads are. They're supposed to roam the rural areas around Allegheny County. I don't know if that was for sure it, but I'll never go out in those woods alone again, just in case it was those melonheads. I don't know if they're evil or not, but the stories are definitely creepy. I live in England, and this story happened to me when I was somewhere between 10 to 12 years old. My family and I were on the way back from taking my brother's friend home, and since we had our dog Mickey, we decided to take a shortcut through the woods. Shortly after heading into this small forested area, my dad and brother went on ahead, leaving my mom, our dog Mickey, and I behind to walk on our own. The forest, as I said before, wasn't exactly the biggest. It was a small area that I believe was used as a community area after someone used it for their garden. A few minutes into the walk, and talking about our days, my mom and I realized we could hear something behind us. Looking back, we initially saw nothing, and thought nothing really of it, although it was pitch black outside at this point, and the only real lights came from the occasional car that would meander down the main road a little ways after. After waiting a few more minutes, we finally decided it was probably just an animal, and turned and continued on our walk. After a bit of walking, though, we began to hear voices. Creeped out, we sped up to my dad and brother. Mickey had been barking and feeling very weird. The entire feel of the forest was just so unnerving at this point. The voices we heard were definitely not adult, and we can't imagine kids being out so late. We eventually got out of the forested area and decided it'd be better to go back on a normal day. There's something out there, and I'm not going back to find out what. So I live in a very wooded area. I'm a 21-year-old female and I live with my grandparents and two of my brothers on the very top of a huge mountain with nothing but trees on all sides. Now, I have lived here since I was able to walk, and I know these woods like the back of my hand. When I was little, my brothers and I basically lived in these hills from sunrise to sunset. We found some pretty cool things and have been freaked out a few times from coyotes and snakes. A few months ago, we saw something that still gives me goosebumps just from riding it. Honestly, I don't have a clue what it was and we haven't seen it since. But like I said, our house sits on a huge mountain, and there is a decent-sized field right below our house, and we can see the whole field from our porch. My brother and I walked out on the porch at around 11 p.m. to smoke a cigarette, since our grandparents don't allow it in the house. It was just starting to rain and you could hear the crickets and all the little creatures at night, and I absolutely loved it. So, we're sitting on this porch just talking, smoking, and listening to the rain, and all at once, everything stopped. And I mean everything stopped, except a small, constant drop of water. The best way I can describe the dripping was that it was an echo, and remained constant, like it never sped up or slowed down. My brother looked over to me, because he heard the sound too, so we stood up to look around for the source of the sound. But I couldn't tell where it was coming from, and my brother tapped me on the shoulder and whispered, "What the hell was that?" I turned over to see where he was pointing, and I saw it down in the field. It was easy to see because I walked right into the middle of the moonlight. It was huge. I say about 7.5 feet tall at least. It was kinda hunched over and walked on two legs. Its skin was very pale and it didn't look like it had fur or anything, but a white light shimmered from it brighter than the moonlight. It walked like it was in slow motion and then it just stops and looks directly at us. It didn't even have facial features, but we could both feel its stare somehow. It never moved, and I've never ran so fast in my life. We hightailed it into the house, but when we looked out the window, it was going back into the woods. We haven't seen it since, but last night my brother heard the dripping noise from his bedroom. That's what made me want to write this. I just want to know what this thing is. I don't believe we're endangered though, because there was a time for it to attack, it would have been that night. If you know what this is, I'd really appreciate knowing.
Nine years ago, I was living on the island of Maui with my family. I took the family dog for a walk pretty late one night since he was restless. It was dark out, so I stuck to the sides of the street. Near the lampposts, my dog stopped and sniffed, so I assumed he had to use the restroom and I waited. I looked around. obviously not wanting to watch him go to the bathroom. While I was looking around in the neighbor's yard, I saw what looked to be a person hunched over, digging. The neighbors had many beautiful plants along their fencing, so I assumed maybe someone was doing late-night gardening. Odd, but so was me being out at like 11 or so walking the dog. I watched, wondering if I should offer help. The person stopped and just stayed there, hunched over. They were very frail, with grossly disproportionately long arms and legs, and I realized that they were naked. It was, as I mentioned, very dark out. They were hairless and still facing towards the home. Their skin was very pale, with a slight, peachy orange color reflecting onto them when the porch light turned on. I thought maybe I was imagining things, but I looked down at my dog again and he was staring over towards it too. I stepped back quietly and hurried him away, checking over my shoulder every now and then. It did not follow us. I don't know if it was really some nutty old person, a fleshgate or something like that. We'd moved very far away, and I think about it every now and then.
The following story happened when I was 10. It has remained in the back of my mind and in dreams for years after. As a kid, I'd often stack my toys on my windowsill and play with them. My window looked out to the front lawn, and I always loved the view. I also was a nosy kid, so I kind of liked seeing what was going on outside. Something about watching the neighbors go about their daily routines just made me feel safe, and I really did enjoy it. Sometimes, when bored, I'd even watch the animals we had around the area. The window I speak of was pretty big. It had a screen between the window and outside as well, which helped keep the cats from jumping out, as I'd often keep the window open, much like I had it today. On that day in question, I was just chilling in front of the window, reading, and also people watching and snooping where I could. As I'm reading, I suddenly get this sense something's watching me. Looking up, I see something standing there. It had the body of a man, the head of a jackal, and looked like a twisted version of Anubis, for a lack of better visual. This thing would just stand there, watching me, a sinister smile on its face as it did. I remember his ears were extremely pointed and would stick up as though he were on alert. I was frozen in place, afraid as the thing stared at me. This lasted for what seemed like an eternity, before the thing finally lumbered off into a wooded lot next door. Once I was able to move again, I rushed for the front door to see if I could get a better view of the thing. To my surprise, it had simply disappeared. After this day, I never left my window open again. I kept the blinds closed, and even today, I keep the black curtains over them, refusing to look outside my window again. I'm still unsure of what that thing was, but it felt quite predatory. I'm just grateful I never saw it in person again, and I hope I never do. If any of you possibly have any idea what this thing could have been, I would love to know. It's the fall of 2017, and my son and I camped in the mountains so we could be there the moment bow season started. We built a small, two-man structure to set in for the night. We then began eating and chilled. Around midnight, we decided it was best to go ahead and hit the sack. Just as we are about to enter our structure, we hear footsteps heading in our direction from the left hillside. 5 minutes pass and we stop hearing what we decide is likely a bear passing through. We crash, and an hour later, we awake to the sound of crashing through the underbrush. We both stared breathlessly in the direction of the crashing, waiting to see a sign of what might be out there. We didn't so much as utter a word while waiting. Soon enough, we see a light cresting over the ridgetop. My first light is, okay, this is someone with a spotlight coming towards us. That's when the light faded, and then reappeared, but this time it was a different color. It went from white to blue, and went out once more. Chills went down my spine as we began moving around for a better look at whatever this thing was. It soon went through the trees, and as it did, it suddenly gained speed and was gone. After a half hour, we gained the confidence and nerve to check out the area it had been in, and also where it had gone. There wasn't a single footprint, even as so much as a disturbed leaf. I'm not sure what this was, but since it first happened, we've experienced many other things just like this. I've heard of things like the lights in the woods, but I never believed in such things. Until now, of course.
My grandpa was telling me a story in the summertime, and I guess I never felt the need to share because I didn't know a platform to share it on existed. But now, I've found one in the form of your show and would love to share it. I apologize if some details are left out. I have forgotten some things that he has told me, such as names and what year it happened in. I believe it happened in the 60s. It happened near the Sandy Bay Aboriginal Reserve, which is in southern Manitoba. It was midwinter, and Manitoba gets plenty of snow. My grandpa told me and his two friends, a wife and husband, were walking from their car to their house carrying all of their luggage. It was just their cabin, not their house, so they were carrying the luggage up to the cabin. The first thing they noticed was a bright light shining into the cabin. It illuminated the entire cabin and was a fluorescent shade of icy blue. The husband thought he saw the silhouette of a strange, tall humanoid in the room. It was lanky and very tall, standing alone before it walked out of sight. Quickly, he ran into the house with his wife. They searched the house and there was nothing, so the wife went back out and grabbed more luggage. The husband said he heard a shriek from outside and quickly ran out to make sure she was okay. He was shocked to find her footprints leading up to the car, yet she was about 25 feet away from the car in the woods, with no tracks leading towards her. If she were to walk out there herself, her tracks would be obviously there. He ran out to her. She was distraught and hollering and screaming, and her eyes were glazed over. He took her in and she refused to speak. She was admitted to a mental hospital soon after, and to this day, she has the same glossed over eyes. She still can't speak. She experienced a horrible trauma out there, and I believe it's because of whatever the humanoid creature was. My grandpa still talks to her husband sometimes. I believe he visited her about 30 years ago at the hospital, since he doesn't live too many hours away. If anyone has any theories about this, feel free to let me know in the comments. If there are any more questions, I'll do my best to answer them.
When I was about 10 years old, my cousin who was 8 at the time and cousin who was 9 all stayed with me in my grandparents' house one night. My cousins lived at the end of the country, so we didn't see him very often, and he has some kind of social difficulties. He is awkward and has never been diagnosed, and was very needy compared to me and my brother. We were all staying in my grandmother's spare room, which had 2 twin beds, which my brother and cousin slept in at one end of the rectangular-shaped room, while I was on the air mattress at the other end of the bedroom, which was directly opposite the bedroom door. My cousin got up whining. He was scared at the dark, and my grandma came upstairs and told him to go back to bed. She left the light on and the door halfway open, at which point we went back to bed. I remember being able to hear the TV downstairs, and my cousin was restless. I was awake but just tried to sleep. Not long later, I remember because I was still awake, I saw through the very dimly lit bedroom what I can only describe as a goblin or dwarf or something. It was only about 2 feet in height. Smack the end of my cousin's head. I saw the silhouette of it run from the bedroom. It didn't move the door, it just sort of maneuvered through the opening. I remember hearing its footsteps as it ran out. I absolutely froze and just laid there, uncertain of what I saw for a moment. My heart was racing and my feet and palms were sweating. I just froze. Seconds later, to my horror, my cousin got up, put the light on, and walked downstairs to see my grandma, complaining that something had banged on his head. The whole time I lay on the air mattress, not wanting to believe what I saw, I just saw my cousin whining, and it confirmed it to me. My grandmother came up and told him to stop being silly and go to bed. I didn't say a word, but I know what I saw. 20 years later, I could still remember the whole thing. My brother was fast asleep throughout. My grandma still lives in the house now. I have had some night terrors in that house when I was little, but other than that, I don't find anything particularly supernatural about it. They've never experienced anything like it before or since. I spoke about it with a friend years later and they said maybe it was a house demon. I'm honestly very unsure myself.